Hello and welcome to Independence, the FIEC podcast. I'm Adrian Reynolds. I'm the head of National Ministries for the FIEC, and I'm joined today by John Stevens, who's our National Director. Hello, John.
Hello, Adrian.
And happy Christmas. I'm allowed to say that because this is a kind of end-of-year review of where we are in Christianity. So if you're listening before December the 31st, happy Christmas, John. And if you're listening after December the 31st, happy New Year, John. So whichever you are, it kind of fits in with you. And recently, John, you gave a little talk to the members of Evangelicals Now, which is a Christian newspaper, just kind of outlining the state of where we are in evangelicalism coming, we hope, out of lockdown. We hope we're not heading back into another one. How has Christianity fared? What's the kind of state of the nation, if you like, when it comes to Christianity? And some really useful things came out of that. I thought it would be useful for us just to rehearse it for our churches, not just to hear what you have to say, but to try between the two of us to apply these things to our local church life. How do they affect local church life? How do they affect leadership? How do they affect ministry? So let me hand over to you. Tell us a little bit about Christianity. What's the state of play in terms of the kind of big picture of how things are at the moment?
Well, thanks so much, Adrian. Yes, it was great to be given sort of 10 minutes just to try to give a brief overview of some of the key things that are happening within the Christian and evangelical world at the moment. And the first of those that I highlighted was, I think, actually in our nation at the moment, Christianity is in really rapid decline.
So Christianity in the
broadest terms,
yeah.
Those who would identify as Christian or churches. I'm not making any claim about their doctrinal position,
Sure.
but just in the broadest sense, Christianity is in rapid decline. Churches are closing. I think particularly we see that within the liberal denominations. Many are in near meltdown, and I think that has been exacerbated by the COVID crisis. We've seen the kind of collapse of folk religion and cultural Christianity. So the statistics are really concerning for the Methodists, the Church of Scotland, the Church of England, the URC, some Baptist Union churches. And essentially the next 10 to 15 years will see the extinction of many congregations and maybe even whole denominations. I think in many of these groupings, the level of ministry that's being maintained at the moment is unsustainable. So they have buildings to maintain, they have employed ministry that simply can't be continued.
Do they have funds to maintain it? I mean, you often read about the church commissioners, for example, having lots of dosh. I mean, do they have funds to sustain things beyond what's essentially reasonable?
They do have funds, but I think the quantity with what's needed to be done to maintain the position is becoming more and more difficult. So even if they have funds, without congregational giving and a congregational base, it's simply unsustainable as it is at the moment. And if you think, for example, of somebody like the Church of England with a building in every parish, many
often
of
very
which,
historic buildings listed and all the rest
absolutely,
of it.
Which cost a huge amount of money to maintain. I mean, there's already been years and years of consolidating, joining parishes together, having shared clergy, making more use of lay clergy to work in churches. The URC has been sustained largely by selling off buildings to be able to continue to fund our ongoing ministry. That, of course, is not something you can continue to do. So I think the picture is unsustainable. Congregations are aging. So average ages are in 60s and 70s. Young people are not coming in. And demographically, that means to say that in 20 years' time, those churches simply won't be there. So I think we are facing the mass decline of Christianity in churches in the UK.
Just as an aside there, is there an opportunity for our churches in terms of buildings up for sale? How does that work? You know, do Methodist Church regularly sell off buildings, for example?
The answer is yes. And I think post-COVID, we've seen quite a number of our churches within FIEC that have been meeting in schools or not had buildings, actually being able to acquire buildings from other denominations where churches are closing. So there are opportunities there. That doesn't necessarily mean that those buildings are available at a reduced cost. So, of course, the organisations that they belong to have a vested interest in getting the most money they can from them to be able to sustain their ministries. It will almost entirely depend upon the denomination or the congregation as to whether they have a desire to want to sell to another Christian group to use the premises. And some may have a theological prejudice against evangelical churches. But yes, there have been some remarkable examples of buildings becoming available because churches have closed.
So no bargains out there probably, but opportunities.
Opportunities to be pursued. And
okay.
I think from the perspective of our churches, we've learnt during COVID that often having a building enables you to engage with the community and minister in an effective way. So I think churches that had been meeting in schools or elsewhere have increasingly looked to acquire premises, and there's certainly an opportunity there. But I think this overall decline of the church inevitably means that what we're seeing is the increased marginalisation of Christianity in the UK. The numbers of people who are churchgoers, who identify with Christian belief, who attend church on a regular basis, who look for the church to meet their needs when they marry, when they sort of die for funerals. That is just going to become less and less part and parcel of British kind of life. I think that's likely to be exacerbated culturally when the Queen dies. In the past few weeks, we've seen the Queen unable to attend a number of events because of illness. She's 95, inevitably physical decline. And I think that will be a major cultural moment in the life of the nation, where the Queen has been representative of the Church of England and a certain kind of Christian presence that will inevitably, I think, be reevaluated on the death of the Queen when Prince Charles probably takes the throne. Will he have quite the same sort of commitment to established Christianity? So I think that will be a significant change. We see it in the way that the major festivals of public life are becoming increasingly secular. They might have been located at times which were determined by the liturgical year or by the church, but they've been sort of given a primarily sort of secular flavour. So I noticed that when I was watching the Festival of Remembrance at the Royal Albert Hall recently. Obviously, there's an element of religious service towards the end, but essentially the entire event is
historically that would have been quite a Christian kind of event, wouldn't it? I mean, if you go back 20 years, it would have been full of hymns and kind of Christian stuff.
Absolutely. Now it's much more kind of popular songs, popular singers, some of which actually the tone of what was being sung seemed to slightly jar with the nature of what the event kind of was. But I think that's inherent to the way that secularism has taken over those existing
and not understanding
festivals.
The Christian culture,
Indeed.
Really, and being able to align with it. Yeah, okay.
So I think the big implication for us is we are simply going to have to face up to our reduced place in the nation. Those who are genuinely committed Christians are going to become a smaller and smaller minority. We've known that as evangelicals for a long time. We've been saying in FIEC over the last few years that the reality is there's probably no more than 2 to 3% evangelical believers in the UK. So we're a very small minority anyway. But the total number of people who might identify with Christianity is going to be significantly reduced. That inevitably affects the amount of power that we have within the nation to influence the culture, that affects our ability to engage on political and moral issues that might be relevant to Christians. It helps us to understand why so often we seem to be on the losing side of what some have described as being the culture wars. It's just a reality. And it reveals the immense gospel need of our nation. The great task is to seek to reach a lost people with the gospel.
I guess that sort of nominalism that's been stripped out from maybe some of the more established parts of the church has not really been present within independency for 20, 25 years, has it? We've had less issues with nominalism, I guess. Have we got something to teach Christian brothers and sisters in those other denominations about what it means to be smaller and purer?
I think you're right. I think that independent churches tend to have been established primarily by evangelicals, often by people who've actually left denominations because they were concerned about theological drift in the direction. They could see that was going to, in the end, undermine the church. So the history of independency is to want to be biblically faithful, and they found that they've had to step outside of existing structures and have operated more on the margins. Even within what you might call the broader church, independents have been marginalised within that as not being part of existing denominations or the established church. But yes, I think that independent ministry has grown significantly, that at the same time that other groupings, particularly liberal Christianity, Catholic Christianity, are declining, those who've stood firm for biblical truth are seeing growth. That's both within independents and those who are still within those sort of denominations. I'm sure that it's becoming more uncomfortable for people within denominations which aren't thoroughly committed to evangelicalism. There are battles going on. So Methodists who were evangelical found it very difficult when the Methodist Church voted to adopt and approve same-sex kind of marriage and relationships. So maybe independency has kind of established a pattern for being able to exist outside of those structures in order to be able to protect biblical faithfulness.
And as you were just hinting there, and this is another of the things you brought up at the meeting, is that actually in that context, it's evangelicalism which is holding its own, isn't it? Rather than Christianity is in rapid decline. The one part of Christianity that you can look at is evangelicalism the only part of Christianity that's holding its own, or are there some other outliers as well?
I think within the UK, it's predominantly evangelicalism that's holding its own. There might be some increase in other forms of Christianity, orthodoxy, various other kinds of Christianity from around the world, which are actually growing as a result of people who are migrating to the UK. So there's that element as well. I mean, we may come on to this later in the situation, but yes, it's largely evangelical churches that are growing. And
they are growing, are they? Evangelicalism is growing compared to the overall decline.
Yeah, I mean, the statistics would suggest that evangelicalism is growing between about 1% and 2% per year. And obviously, there's a large quantity of migration to the UK of people from around the world, many of whom are evangelicals. So in many places, you can see that there's a growing range of churches with a great ethnic diversity. So that has significantly impacted on British Christianity.
It's growing. It's not necessarily growing by new Christians. It's growing by, if you like, mega transfer growth.
It's a bit of both.
Yeah.
So there are new Christians, though that is slower than we would love. But there is also very significant infusion of new Christians. But often those groups are actually really effective evangelistically at reaching out to their communities and diaspora communities within the UK.
And often more theologically orthodox, aren't they? Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Many are coming with very clear biblical convictions and would want to stand for those firmly on the authority of Scripture, the death of Christ, judgment, hell, salvation and rescue from God's judgment. On human sexuality, they would be very orthodox. Sex is only for kind of heterosexual marriage. So yes, they would be infusing very clear biblical convictions. There are obviously significant cultural differences. So a lot of Christians who've come to the UK would come out of an environment in which there's more of a prosperity gospel perspective, but they would be very committed to prayer and wanting to see God work in their lives. They would be, in a sense, entirely comfortable with the idea of the supernatural and God working in remarkable and miraculous ways, in a way that sometimes we Western Christians have become overly rationalistic in the way that we think.
So we've often looked around the world, haven't we, and said that Christianity worldwide is no longer a Western, Northern Hemisphere white religion. It's located predominantly in the South, isn't it? It's often Pentecostal, independent, actually. It's one of the largest groups of churches around the world. We're feeling that now in the UK, right? In terms of evangelicalism is no longer white in its broadest sense.
Oh, absolutely, and the church more generally. So as the church shrinks, it's becoming more evangelical as an overall percentage of those who would identify as Christian, and it's certainly becoming more ethnically diverse. Something like 14% of the UK population are from a sort of a non-white ethnic background, and the percentages of those who would identify as Christian within those ethnic communities would be very much higher. So they're very strong kind of Christian groups from the West Indies, from Africa, very strong Chinese churches within the UK. So yes, there's a growing diversity of the church in the UK and evangelicalism in the UK, which in some ways is a wonderful reflection of the biblical vision of a church that consists of people from every tribe and every nation. And that is now far more evident within Britain itself than it would have been even 50 years ago.
Do you begin to see that in the FIEC? I mean, it feels like the FIEC is slightly behind the curve there, perhaps, and maybe that's historically cultural reasons for that. It'd be interesting to explore that. But is the FIEC catching up in terms of that diversity? Well,
the last data survey that we did of our churches suggested that the number of people attending FIEC churches from an ethnic background was higher than 14%. So it depends what you mean by catching up. If you were to look at the congregations of FIEC churches, there's probably a higher representation of non-white population in Britain than the national average, which I think is a really encouraging thing we've seen in recent years.
Why don't we see that in leadership then?
I think there are a number of factors for that. I think leadership generally takes a little bit longer. In order to lead a church, you need to understand the culture in which the church is located. So within FIEC, there are some churches that are mono-ethnic churches that have come out of a particular immigrant community, and they would, of course, have leaders that have come from that community. Where you have churches that are more of a blended congregation, very often it's taken longer for people to be raised up for leadership who've come from immigrant communities and have joined the church. And I think there's an inevitable time lag in which those who join churches understand them and gain an appreciation that equips them to be able to lead. And in fact, actually, I think you see that in the New Testament, that in the New Testament, many of the leaders of the early church were clearly from a Jewish background. Even when churches were planted in cities around the kind of Mediterranean world, the original leaders were drawn from the synagogues. It's one of the reasons why Paul went to the Jews first, and very often you find that the early leaders had been the leaders of the synagogues who were converted. And then you get a gradual process in which there's an expansion out of leadership. And we shouldn't, I think, telescope the length of times involved in the New Testament. So we can read the book of Acts, it all seems to happen very quickly, but it covers a 40-year period. So some of the steps, for example, the move to the 7 being appointed in Acts chapter 6, who come from a kind of a Greek background rather than Hebrew background, that doesn't happen overnight. Similarly, the development of a multi-ethnic leadership in the church at Antioch, that's part of a long process of the church wrestling with the fact that Gentiles are being converted and coming into the church. And even some of the leaders in those churches would have been from a pagan, from a Greek or Roman background, but they were God-fearers as part of the synagogue. The time that it would have taken for people coming from a completely pagan background to come into the church and be raised up to the leadership, well, that would have taken significantly longer. So I think it's just worth recognizing that developing to leadership often does take a period of time.
Now, you also, helpfully at the Evangelicals Now meeting, told us a little bit about how government sees us. It's sometimes useful, isn't it, to stand on the other side of the fence. Here are we thinking about how we should view government and how church leaders should view the nation and all those kinds of things. And of course, we've been wrestling with those questions, haven't we, throughout COVID and pandemic. Exactly what is the relationship between church and state? And we've often been assessing that question from a church's point of view, but also the government have a view of churches. So how does the government see the church, do you think?
Well, that was really the second thing I was talking about. I think that government is in some ways increasingly conflicted about how to relate to Christians and how to relate to the church. Actually, I was at a reception at Downing Street yesterday, which Boris Johnson had called for church leaders to celebrate Advent and Christmas. And the Prime Minister gave a short speech in which he thanked churches for all that they were doing in the community, for what they'd done during the COVID crisis. Actually, Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, pointed out that the churches that were represented there were between them running at least 40,000 community projects that were benefiting and serving the community. And the Prime Minister indicated that he was grateful for the way that churches were fulfilling Jesus' command to love their neighbours and all that they were doing in the community. And I think at a local level, in many local authorities, they are grateful and aware of all that churches are doing to care for those who are in need of food through food banks or dealing with issues of debt through things like Christians Against Poverty. So there is an immense amount that churches are doing for their local communities. And I think government is aware of that and appreciative of that and grateful that that's not a service that they have to provide for themselves. So there's that, in a sense, positive view of the work and contribution of churches in the community. At the same time, there's an element of, I think, some hostility towards what it is churches believe and teach, particularly in the current environment over the whole issue of human sexuality. And I think because the government is essentially secular, it is suspicious of particularly evangelicals who take the view that sort of sex is only appropriate for heterosexual sort of marriage. So we see this at the moment with the government's introduction of legislation to ban what's called conversion therapy. So there's been a major campaign to, in a sense, criminalise therapies and behaviours that suggest that a person's sexual orientation can be changed. So government has seen that as harmful. People who have experienced that have spoken of the harm that they've suffered as it's kind of questioned their identity and their way of life. And government has responded to that by wanting to ban conversion therapy. Now, I think evangelical Christians recognise there are things that Christians and churches have done in the past that are inappropriate. So some of the activities, the kind of psychological therapies, aversion therapy, forced rape, some of the spiritual therapies, exorcism of people who are struggling with issues of same-sex attraction, most Christians would regard those as inappropriate and wrong.
Got to be called out, haven't they?
They're already actually sort of would-be criminal offences already. Many of them are through the kind of various counselling and psychological regulatory bodies would ban those anyway. But the area at which it's causing most concern, I think, for churches is over the pastoral help that might be provided to people who are struggling with issues of same-sex attraction. So what's being raised is the potential that, say you have somebody in your church who's struggling with same-sex attraction issues and they come to you for pastoral counsel. Would it be a criminal offence to counsel them, to encourage them to live by biblical standards, to pray with them, to enable them to have God's help to be able to do that? So normal fight against sin that many of us take for granted in gospel ministry has the potential to be criminalised. I think at one level what's happening there is government is clearly wanting to virtue signal to the LGBTQ community, and to some extent the church, I think, is collateral damage to that in what's happening here. And I think within government, this is not particularly surprising, but there is a high level of, I think, an illiteracy about what Christians really believe.
I was going to say, is there any nuance? So when there was a select committee, wasn't there, thinking about conversion therapy, and I saw clips on the news of Jane Ozanne speaking as somebody who identifies as a believer and evangelical, I think, and saying, this is wrong, it needs to be banned. I think it was someone from the Christian Institute, was it Simon Calvert, I think, or someone from the Christian Institute, putting a kind of an evangelical point of view. Does the government understand that nuance? Or does it kind of just see Christianity as a block?
Well, I think we have to recognise that we as Christians don't always understand that nuance, and across the Christian constituency, it's difficult, and we appear to be divided. And people have a tendency to listen to the voice that says what they want to hear, which suits a particular narrative. So I don't think we should necessarily blame government for having that illiteracy. From their perspective, the church is a relatively small sector of society. Many of the key government ministers, MPs, officials involved probably have very little real experience of churches. They've probably come across the bad caricatures or the worst examples of what is done.
Yes, the TV vicars as well. Kind of never helped, do they?
Absolutely. I mean, the narrative of the media about evangelical Christians is invariably negative. It's hard to see a positive portrayal. In fact, in most programs, that it's the evangelical Christian who will be revealed as a hypocrite, and they'll be the one who did it. And that just drip effect obviously impacts on the way that government sort of thinks. So I think there is a great task that we need to perform of communicating with government and urging that religious literacy, and graciously and gently explaining and modelling what it is that we really believe. So the government is conflicted, and they are having to wrestle with the challenges of a secular society with mutually incompatible kind of viewpoints, and to try to navigate between those different groups, and in a sense to try to maintain the freedoms of all of them. Christians haven't always been great in the past at wanting to defend the freedoms of others. So I think we have sometimes had a view which seems to suggest that we want a nation in which Christians are given a privileged status, and therefore others are not free to live as they would choose. And we're living with the consequences of that, in that the way that we treated others in the past is now the way that we are being treated now that we're a minority. And I think we need to honestly sort of recognise that. I think another challenge from the government's point of view is it's not only illiteracy maybe about Christianity, but there is a tendency to leap or lump all faith groups together. So from the government perspective, they tend to think of secular and faith groups. And some of the attitudes towards kind of discrimination, wanting to prevent inequality, actually causes government not to want to differentiate between the beliefs and practices of different religious groups.
So give us an example of what you mean by that.
Well, what I mean is, if you think there are major religious groups of kind of Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, there might be practices in particular religious groups that sort of government are less likely to want to highlight and identify because of the danger of being seen as being unfair towards a group or discriminating against a particular group. So they would rather talk about faith as if it's one unified category. So, not all religions believe the same thing. Not all religions practice in the same way. On an issue like homosexuality, the force of opinions and how those are held will vary across those different religious kind of groups. But it's easier for government to treat faith groups as if they're sort of one particular block that have a common interest or common problems. And I think we just have to be sort of aware that that's how we're treated.
There's a bit of light, isn't there? The government have appointed someone to kind of promote freedom of religion, haven't they? Is that right?
Yes, the government has expressed a commitment to want to, in a sense, advocate for religious freedom and particularly against the persecution of Christians around the world. It's clear that Christians are the most persecuted group around the world in religious terms, very often in Muslim countries where the greatest persecution kind of takes place. Philip Mount Stephen, who's the Bishop of Truro, produced a report a couple of years ago highlighting persecution. The government has said that they want to take action on the basis of that. They've appointed Fiona Bruce, who's an MP, to be the Prime Minister's special envoy on these issues of religious freedom and tolerance. She's a committed Christian. And David Burrows, who was formerly an MP and is an elder in an FIEC church, has been appointed her deputy with a view to, in a sense, promoting freedom of religion and keeping government to account for its commitments to stand against persecution. So those are sort of positive situations. So I don't think it's either, I'm not saying it's either positive or negative. I do think there is this element of conflict within government, that they can see some of the benefits that Christians and the church bring, but there are other areas where there's a conflict with other interest groups they're also seeking to serve. And I think we need to have some awareness of the degree of challenge that government is faced with, and as we engage with government, to at least show some understanding of that and realization of the position in which we find ourselves.
And tell us about, as we draw towards the end of this podcast, it does feel like a significant moment. Is that just because we've been in lockdown and now we're not, or is there more to it than that? Is this a significant moment, do you think, in terms of cultural change?
Well, yeah, I do think that sort of it seems at the moment there is a major cultural shift that's going on in society. And I think the challenge is that is something that's unfolding, but I'm not sure we're certain quite where it's going. So it does feel as though this is a moment of change. In many ways, I think that what's happening in the world and in the country is the post-war consensus that we've lived with, really since the Cold War came to an end, is kind of breaking down. It's breaking down at a kind of a global level, with the sort of the ending of kind of supreme American power, the rise of China, the rise of India, the decline of kind of Europe. That's raising all sorts of questions about the nature of sort of national identity and national purpose. I think for Britain, we're constantly sort of asking that question of where do we fit in the world after the empire? How do we view our history? What does that mean for our future? So I think there's a lot of uncertainty around that a kind of question. Underlying many of these issues, I think, is a deep generational divide. It's not entirely a generational divide, but there is a very significant generational divide between a younger generation who see the world completely differently. They see the primary problems as being different problems. They look for different solutions to those problems. I think some of the ways that that's playing out is we're seeing a bit of a shift to collectivism rather than the individualism that dominated in the kind of Thatcher-Reagan era. There seems to be much more concern for issues of equality and justice over areas like race, gender, and climate. And that kind of distinction can sometimes, or that intergenerational divide, is characterized sometimes polemically as the snowflakes against the boomers or the woke against the populists. Within the Christian world, there's lots of debate at the moment, lots of talk about whether society is being taken over by a cultural Marxism, critical race theory, other views about the nature that power is used abusively, and some want to entirely reject that. And there are others who would say that actually these kind of analytical frameworks, even though they're not biblical, do in fact expose genuine injustices that actually, when you read the Bible, are things that the Bible is just as critical of. So I think that's what's going on within wider society. There does feel that there's a sense of a passing older generation and a coming generation that shares different values. Populism seems to be something that around the world people have leapt onto. There are just some indications that that's beginning to be rejected. It hasn't delivered what was expected. It's been disappointing. So I think we're in a period of cultural flux. But I think it seems to me that that's something that societies go through on a regular basis. This is in fact nothing new. It's a regular kind of phenomenon between different generations. Every 15 to 25 years, there seems to be this moment of kind of cultural flux, which then leads to the emergence of some kind of new consensus the other side of it. So you saw it at the end of World War II. with the surprising defeat of Winston Churchill at the end of the election, at the end of the war, despite his kind of war record and victory, which then led to a kind of a new consensus across British politics. In many ways, you saw it in the 1960s with the sexual and political kind of revolution. Then you saw it in the 1980s, really, with the Thatcherite, Reaganite revolution in kind of America and the UK. You saw it in the 1990s with the kind of post-Cold War Western imperialism. And it seems to me that that's the kind of environment that we're in at the moment. Yeah, so there are these moments of what you might call revolutionary ferment. And often out of them, what happens is you have a new leadership that emerges. Although it's all in fairly radical terms to begin with, what actually happens is it leads to the emergence of a new consensus. And very often the radicals become more mainstream or even become kind of reactionaries. So I do think we're in that position. And that's uncertain and unsettling for the church. It's hard for us at the moment to see where it will land and how that will happen. It's hard to see where leadership will come from. We're not prophets. We don't have a God's eye view to understanding what happens. So I think that is an unsettling and challenging period for us. Having said that, I think the fact that we can look back historically and say this has happened before is
so the church
a
came through
comfort.
1945 and it came through the
Indeed.
60s and it came through the 80s.
I think even more than that, we can be confident that the gospel is always unchanging. So actually 2,000 years of church history, there have been massive challenges, cultural changes that the church has had to endure. But the gospel is not changed by any of those. Obviously, we have to contextualize the gospel in an appropriate way for the moment that we're in. But as Christians, we need to, in a sense, have confidence that neither conservatism nor revolution are the answer. And as we see all these kind of cultural trends, Christians shouldn't be leaping on any of those bandwagons. They are not the answer. They may contain elements of truth that is more fully revealed in the gospel, but they are not the answer to the problems of society. Ultimately, it's the gospel that is the answer. And one of the challenges, I think, for us as particularly churches and leaders is as we're in this time of ferment, we need to be able to be speaking to both sides of that divide and that division, particularly as we seek to reach people outside of the church. So rather than taking one side or the other, if we want to reach everybody, we need to become able to speak the gospel to sort of both sides in a way that connects and in a way that shows them that it's really Jesus who's the answer, not the political or cultural forces.
Which, of course, reinforces the great need and importance of raising up a new generation of leaders.
Oh, absolutely.
From a younger generation. I think the idea that us as mid-50-ish, early 50s pastors can kind of cross over that divide easily. The older we get, the more difficult it's going to be, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So that's why we need the new generation of leaders.
We need a new generation of leaders who understand. Actually, we need that new generation of leaders to help older generations of leaders to understand so that we can learn how to speak effectively into that situation. But the danger is if we don't do that, what we will have is churches that are identified by a particular political culture rather than identified by the gospel, because they're shaped around the particular outlook of their leaders. And what you end up with then is a very divided church in which it's no longer the gospel that is governing, but it's a particular political or cultural position.
Great. Well, thanks very much, John. Thanks for your insights. Some interesting things to ponder on there. And some of those subjects we're going to come back to in future episodes. So do subscribe to the FIEC podcast through your normal channel provider. This has been Independence, the FIEC podcast. Thanks, John, for joining us. And we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.